God help the man who marries her. The words travelled farther than William Somerville intended, clean as a dropped knife across the warm hush of the orangery. It was the evening of November 27th, 1816, at Larkfield Park in Hampshire, and outside the tall panes winter had blackened the lawns into mirrors of frost. Inside, candlelight gleamed over orange trees in painted tubs, polished brass, and the pale faces of guests lingering after dinner. Frances Mordaunt stood near a camellia with her late mother's tortoiseshell lorgnette, resting lightly between two gloved fingers. She had learned years ago that the edge of a room could be kinder than its center. At 32, unmarried and possessed of just enough independent income to decline invitations she disliked, she had no need to chase favor. She had accepted the Dowager Duchess of Norchester's invitation because Larkfield's winter houses contained specimens she genuinely wished to catalogue, not because she imagined a ducal roof might improve her prospects. That distinction mattered to Frances, though she suspected it mattered to almost no one else. The Dowager Duchess had discovered her careful notes on greenhouse cultivation through a mutual acquaintance and had asked, with refreshing directness, whether Frances might help compare Larkfield's winter catalogue against its living collection. Frances had agreed because plants did not care whether a woman had a husband. They responded to light, soil, neglect, and patience with an honesty society rarely managed. Across the orangery, Lady Judith Blythe glittered beneath an evening turban crowned with 3 black ostrich plumes, each wound at the quill with fine silver wire. The feathers rose dramatically whenever she turned her head, which she did often as if rooms existed chiefly to register the movement. Her brother, Lord Jasper Blythe, lounged beside a marble-topped table with the easy confidence of a man who had never been required to make himself agreeable to anyone beneath his notice. The conversation had begun harmlessly enough. Marriage, someone had said, was difficult because men and women expected too much honesty from one another. Jasper laughed. A clever wife knows when not to contradict her husband. It's practically a domestic virtue. Several people smiled because he was titled, handsome, and certain they would. Frances lowered the lorgnette through which she had been examining a camellia bud. Then surely the cleverest wife of all would be one with no opinions. Jasper turned toward her. You say that as though it were absurd. I say it because a woman trained never to disagree is not a wife. She's an echo. A brief silence followed. Then William laughed. He had not meant the sound cruelly. That was almost worse. He had spent his life in rooms where wit softened boredom and rank protected a man from examining the cost of his amusement. Frances had answered Jasper so quickly and with such exact calm that William felt an unexpected jolt of delight. She had not sought his attention. She had not even looked toward him until he spoke. God help the man who marries her, he said. A few guests laughed. Jasper's mouth curved. Lady Judith's eyes sharpened. Frances went entirely still. William saw too late that she had heard every word. She turned her head and met his gaze. The lorgnette remained lowered at her side. There was no blush of girlish confusion, no wounded appeal, no attempt to soften herself for him. Her face held only intelligence and something colder. Dignity, perhaps. The realization came to William with uncomfortable force. He had not teased a willing participant in a game. He had made a judgment before witnesses, and because he was the Duke of Norchester, those witnesses would hear more authority in it than he had intended to give. Their eyes held for one beat, then another, Something in William's amusement vanished. Frances inclined her head. Then Providence may be grateful. Your Grace has no intention of volunteering. This time the silence was absolute. Jasper stared. Someone near the citrus trees made a strangled sound that might have been a cough. William felt the corner of his mouth threaten to rise. Not because he wished to laugh at her again, but because the answer was magnificent. He stopped the impulse before it became visible. Frances had already given him more grace than he deserved by answering, rather than allowing his words to define the moment. "Miss Mordaunt," he began. She bowed with perfect correctness. "Your Grace." Then she turned away. She did not hurry. That, more than anger might have done, left the room uncertain what to do with itself. Frances crossed toward the farther end of the orangery, passing beneath the glass roof where candlelight fractured against the dark panes. Her pulse had begun to beat hard beneath the calm she kept upon her face. She refused to let anyone see it. There were humiliations one survived by silence, and humiliations one survived by remembering that the people inflicting them were not qualified to measure one's worth. Her mother had taught her the difference. The lorgnette in her hand had belonged to that same woman who had once told Frances that distance could make a room easier to understand. Frances wished, for one sharp instant, that distance could also make words less audible. Behind her, conversation restarted in cautious fragments. Lady Judith was the first to recover. "Well," she said lightly, "Miss Mordaunt has never lacked courage." The sentence sounded complimentary until the final word made it clear that courage was being offered as a prettier substitute for insolence. William looked at Judith. Nor should she. Judith's brows lifted. "I didn't say she should. No." His answer came flatter than he intended. She smiled anyway. Frances reached the next bank of plants and forced herself to examine the label tied beneath a flowering camellia. Camellia japonica. The ink had faded at the edge. She read it twice without taking in a single word. She had endured remarks about being unmarried before. Women of 32 did not move through society without discovering how many people considered their marital state a public subject. Yet William's words had landed differently. A duke did not need to intend harm for harm to follow him. His rank magnified careless things. Tomorrow, someone would remember his sentence and forget her answer. Next week, perhaps, it would become proof that Frances Mordaunt was too sharp, too difficult, too unwilling to bend into the comfortable shape expected of a wife. She hated that she knew exactly how such things grew. William remained where she had left him for 3 breaths. Then he moved, though not toward her. An apology offered before the same amused witnesses might become another performance and force Frances to receive it for their benefit. He would not compound the insult merely because remorse had arrived quickly. Instead, he turned back toward Jasper, who was still smiling. "You appear pleased with yourself." Jasper lifted his glass. "I merely admire a woman who can survive your Grace's judgment." It was not a judgment. Of course not. Jasper's tone made the opposite interpretation effortless. William's jaw tightened. Across the room, Judith touched one of the silver-wound plumes above her brow and leaned toward Mrs. Holbury, an elderly widow famous for remembering every sentence that ought to have been forgotten. William could not hear the first words. He did not need to. Mrs. Holbury's eyes traveled immediately toward Frances. Judith smiled behind her fan. Then William heard the fragment, delivered with delicate amusement. His Grace said it himself. God help the man. Frances had not yet reached the orangery door. The sentence was already no longer his. By breakfast the next morning, William had discovered that a careless sentence could travel faster through a country house than any messenger on horseback. It had moved through drawing rooms, corridors, guest chambers, and servants' passages until it no longer belonged to him at all. He heard the first altered version before he had taken his second cup of coffee. Lord Jasper Blythe was standing near the sideboard, speaking to Sir Matthew Hale and two ladies who had arrived late to breakfast. Miss Mordaunt survived, His Grace's opinion, remarkably well, Jasper said, though I suppose a woman who enjoys contradiction must grow accustomed to warnings. Frances sat halfway down the long table beside the Dowager Duchess, her posture composed, her attention apparently fixed on a plate of toast she had scarcely touched. William saw the faint tightening of her fingers around the handle of her teacup. He also saw Lady Judith glance toward him, waiting. That expectation irritated him more than the gossip itself. He set down his coffee. "If my opinion is to be repeated," he said, not loudly, though the room quieted at once, "it should at least be repeated accurately." Jasper turned with a smile. "Naturally, Your Grace." William looked directly at him. "Miss Mordaunt was not discourteous last night. I was." There was a pause. Frances lifted her eyes. William did not look away. She answered a foolish remark about wives with more sense than the remark deserved. My own response was careless, and I regret that I gave anyone reason to treat it as a judgment of her character. Sir Matthew became interested in his eggs. One of the ladies lowered her spoon. Jasper's smile thinned. Judith recovered first. "Surely no one imagined Your Grace meant anything serious. Then no one should have found it useful enough to repeat." William's voice remained even. He had no desire to turn apology into spectacle, but the injury had become public before he could prevent it. Private remorse would not repair a public distortion. The Dowager Duchess, who had been buttering toast with the unhurried concentration of a woman who missed very little, said, "That seems sufficiently clear." Frances still watched William. Her expression was not softened. He had not expected it to be. What surprised him was the relief he felt that she did not offer him easy absolution. A less independent woman might have smiled to rescue him from the discomfort of his own apology. Frances merely inclined her head once. It was acknowledgment, nothing more. William found he respected the distinction. Jasper gave a short laugh. "Then I stand corrected." "Yes," William said. "You do." That ended the conversation, though not the memory of it. Frances finished her tea and rose with the other ladies when breakfast dispersed. She did not linger. William made no attempt to follow her. He had already learned one lesson since the previous evening. Regret did not entitle a man to immediate access to the person he had wounded. The day passed beneath a low winter sky, with guests divided between cards, correspondence, a short ride for those willing to brave the cold, and the Dowager Duchess's plans for an informal dance after dinner. Frances spent much of the afternoon in the orangery with two gardeners, comparing labels against a notebook. William crossed the adjoining gallery once and saw her through the glass doors. She held her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette in one hand while leaning over a pot of white camellias. He could have entered. Instead, he continued walking. He was beginning to understand that noticing her did not require interrupting her. By evening, however, the house had changed mood. Candlelight softened the drawing room. A small group of musicians had been placed near the windows, and chairs were moved back for a quadrille. Frances stood beside the Dowager Duchess at first, dressed in pale dove-coloured silk, with no ornament more extravagant than a narrow jet comb. Lady Judith, by contrast, wore black velvet trimmed with silver embroidery. The 3 black plumes from the previous evening had been replaced by a jewelled comb, but William found himself remembering them anyway. Judith was arranging partners with the effortless authority of a woman who assumed rooms would cooperate. Sir Matthew with Lady Anne, Mr. Colebrook with Miss Fenner. She glanced down her list, then toward Francis. How awkward. We appear to have one gentleman too few. Francis's face did not alter. Then the arithmetic has defeated us. A few people smiled. Judith returned the smile sweetly. You do make everything sound deliberate. Only the deliberate things. William, standing near the mantel, heard the exchange and understood it at once. Judith was not merely omitting Francis. She was framing the omission as a natural consequence of the previous night. Proof that sensible gentlemen had become cautious. Perhaps, Judith continued, Miss Mordaunt would prefer to sit out the first set. After all, some gentlemen might hesitate to risk being corrected in public. Francis's chin lifted by the smallest degree. Before she could answer, William crossed the room. He did not look at Judith. He stopped before Francis and bowed. Miss Mordaunt, may I have the first set? Every nearby conversation seemed to lose a word. Francis looked at him steadily. Is this an apology, Your Grace? There was no flirtation in the question. It was a test of honesty. William found he preferred it that way. No, he said. The apology was this morning. This is a request. Something changed in her eyes. Not forgiveness. Perhaps surprise. Perhaps approval that he had not confused restitution with entitlement. She let the silence remain long enough that everyone understood she was deciding rather than obeying. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. Then yes. The contact was entirely proper. It should have meant nothing. A quadrille required hands to meet and part, bodies to move within prescribed figures, distance and proximity measured by music and custom. Yet William became conscious of every brief moment when Francis's fingers rested in his. She did not cling. She did not avoid him either. During the first figure, their eyes met across the line of dancers. This time, he did not mistake the intelligence in her expression for challenge merely because it made him more aware of himself. You are very serious tonight, she murmured when the pattern brought them near. I am attempting not to say anything regrettable. Francis's mouth almost curved. That must be exhausting. You have no idea. I suspect I do. They separated again with the figure. William laughed, but quietly, and this time the sound belonged between them rather than at her expense. When the set ended, he returned Francis to the Dowager Duchess and bowed. He did not ask for a second dance. That restraint appeared to surprise Francis more than the first request had. Thank you, she said, for the dance, for understanding that one was enough. William met her gaze. I am trying to improve. So I noticed. It was the nearest thing to warmth she had given him. He carried it away with disproportionate satisfaction. Across the room, Judith watched Francis resume her place beside the Dowager Duchess. Jasper joined his sister near the refreshment table. Their voices were low, but William saw Judith's expression harden as she followed his retreating glance toward Francis. He was supposed to lose interest, she said. Jasper lifted one shoulder. Perhaps he enjoys opposition. Judith's eyes narrowed. No, he enjoys novelty. And novelty can be made ridiculous. Jasper looked at her then. What are you suggesting? Judith kept her attention on Francis, who was speaking calmly to an elderly guest as though nothing had changed, only that Miss Mordaunt should become tiresome before His Grace begins taking her seriously. By the 5th of December, Larkfield Park had settled into the particular rhythm of a country house, preparing to carry its winter pleasures to London. Invitations were being discussed over breakfast. Trunks were already being aired in upper rooms. And the Dowager Duchess had begun speaking of Norchester House as though February were no farther away than the next corridor. Frances Mordaunt found the transition mildly unsettling. Hampshire, even under frost, gave her places to disappear into usefulness. London would offer fewer greenhouses and more eyes. That afternoon, however, the drawing-room was occupied by something more immediate than the coming season. Lady Judith Blythe had spread several costume sketches across a low table and was holding court over them with the confidence of a general reviewing troops. "Black silk," she said, lifting one page, "silver embroidery at the sleeve, and the same plumes I wore last week. I don't see why one should purchase excellent feathers only to wear them once." Frances, seated near the window with the Dowager Duchess, glanced up. The 3 black ostrich plumes were resting in a long, shallow box beside Judith, their quills still wound with the same fine silver wire she had noticed in the orangery. "They are difficult to overlook," Frances said. Judith smiled. "That is generally the purpose of a feather." Lord Jasper Blythe, leaning against the mantel with a glass in one hand, added, "Or of a woman who chooses 3 of them." Judith ignored him. The Dowager Duchess examined another sketch. "And this is for the masquerade at Norchester House. If your Grace approves." "I approve of anything that does not require me to pretend I enjoy shepherdesses." Judith laughed. "Then I am safe." Frances looked back at the notebook in her lap. She had been comparing 2 entries from the Larkfield catalogue. But Judith's costume discussion had begun to attract the attention of everyone in the room. Mrs. Hulbury wanted to know whether masks would be full or half. Sir Matthew preferred Roman dress. A young lady near the fire declared that white dominoes were too common. William entered midway through the argument and stopped beside his mother's chair. "Have I arrived too late to prevent civilization from collapsing over ribbon?" "Much too late," the Dowager Duchess said. "Judith has committed herself to black and silver. Then civilization may yet recover." Judith tilted her head toward him. "And what will your Grace wear?" "Whatever allows me to recognize myself by midnight." "A mask might improve you," Frances said without looking up. There was a small silence. William turned toward her. Frances lifted her eyes from the notebook, only after she realized everyone else had done so first. His expression held surprise, then amusement. "Miss Mordaunt, I had begun to hope you thought me beyond improvement. That would be uncharitable and discouraging. Only if you are committed to remaining exactly as you are." He laughed. The sound came easily, but unlike the laugh that had wounded her in the orangery, this one did not make her feel placed on display. It invited rather than judged. William seemed to recognize the difference at the same instant, because his gaze stayed on hers for a fraction longer than courtesy required. He did not look embarrassed. He looked pleased. Judith noticed. Frances saw that too. She returned her attention to the notebook before the moment could acquire more importance than it deserved. "And Miss Mordaunt?" Judith asked. "What disguise will you choose?" "Something simple." "That is not a disguise. For some people it would be." Jasper laughed aloud. Judith's smile thinned. "Silver grey, perhaps. It would suit you." Frances considered the suggestion. A plain domino would be practical. "A half mask?" the Dowager Duchess asked. "Yes, Your Grace. I would prefer to retain some ability to see where I am going." William glanced toward the tortoiseshell lorgnette, resting beside Francis's notebook. "You do possess equipment for observation." Francis followed his glance and touched the folded lorgnette lightly. "It has advantages a mask may lack." Judith pulled a sheet of grey paper from beneath the sketches. "There, something like this. Silver grey silk, no excessive trim, narrow hood, half mask, severe enough to suit Miss Mordaunt's reputation." William's expression changed before Francis could answer. "Her reputation for what?" Judith looked innocently surprised. "Restraint, of course." "Then say restraint." His tone remained courteous, but the correction landed cleanly. Judith's eyes cooled. Francis watched William for a moment. He had not turned the matter into a rescue. He had simply denied Judith the opportunity to make another veiled insult sound harmless. That mattered more than Francis wished it did. "Silver grey is acceptable," she said, "provided no one mistakes severity for tragedy." Jasper raised his glass. "At a masquerade, mistakes are half the entertainment." Francis looked at him. "Masks reveal more fools than they conceal." William laughed again, quieter this time. He caught himself only after the sound had escaped, and Francis saw something almost boyish in the brief surprise on his face. "You are going to make London exhausting," he said. "I have no intention of exhausting London." "Then I fear London may attempt the task first. It has survived worse women than I." "That," Judith said, "is precisely the sort of confidence that attracts notice." Francis turned toward her. "I was not aware confidence required permission." Before Judith could answer, William said, "It does not." He did not say more. He did not need to. The Dowager Duchess shifted the conversation toward music, and the room loosened around the moment. Still, Francis felt Judith's attention settle on her with new weight. By the time tea was brought, the silver grey domino had been agreed upon in principle. Judith's black costume would keep the 3 silver-wired plumes. William had declared that he would postpone his own decision until someone invented a costume requiring no explanation. Jasper had volunteered that the Duke could simply dress as a man deprived of opinions. Francis had replied that the deception might be too ambitious. William had looked directly at her before laughing, as though her reaction now mattered to him before anyone else's did. Francis disliked noticing that. She disliked even more that she did not entirely dislike it. Later that evening, while the rest of the house gathered for cards, Judith remained upstairs under the pretense of a headache. Her maid had been dismissed. A single candle burned beside her writing desk. The 3 black plumes lay in their shallow box, one silver-wound quill catching the light each time the flame moved. Judith unfolded a note from her London modiste, read it twice, and then took up her pen. She wrote with the measured hand of a woman accustomed to having servants carry inconvenient intentions for her. The order was simple. A second silver-grey domino was required before the Norchester masquerade. It must match the first in colour, fall and hood as closely as possible. No additional ornament, no identifying embroidery. No inquiry was to be made of Miss Mordaunt, and no mention of the duplicate was to reach Larkfield Park. Judith sanded the note, folded it, and sealed it without using any family crest. When Jasper entered 10 minutes later, she was tying the message with plain thread. "You are working hard for a headache," he said. Judith did not look up. "Francis has chosen silver grey. I was present. You were listening to yourself." Jasper took the chair opposite. "And what exactly requires secrecy?" Judith slid the folded note across the desk. He read it, then looked at her. You want another costume? I want options. For what? Judith glanced toward the long box containing the 3 black plumes. For London. Jasper leaned back slowly. You said she needed to become ridiculous. She does. And you intend to help her? Judith smiled then, but there was no amusement in it, only enough that everyone believes she has done it herself. By the 18th of December, the cold had sharpened enough to silver the lawns before sunrise. But the orangery at Larkfield Park held a gentler season beneath its glass. Francis Mordaunt preferred it there. The drawing rooms had become louder as Christmas approached, crowded with plans, games, opinions, and the increasing anticipation of London in the new year. The orangery asked less of her. Plants did not interpret silence as offense. They did not turn independence into a challenge or intelligence into an accusation. That morning, she stood before a winter camellia with her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette raised to one eye, studying the edge of a pale bud that had opened earlier than the gardener expected. She had left her notebook on a nearby table. Sunlight, weak but clean, entered through the eastern panes and caught along the polished shell of the lorgnette. I had assumed those were intended for ballrooms. William's voice came from behind her. Francis lowered the lorgnette before turning. The Duke of Norchester stood just inside the orangery doors, dressed for the morning in a dark blue coat and buff trousers, his gloves in one hand. He had not approached silently so much as she had been paying attention elsewhere. They are intended for seeing, she said. Ballrooms merely provide more reasons to require assistance. William smiled. Your eyesight appears excellent. It is. Then, I am forced to suspect the instrument serves another purpose. Francis looked at the lorgnette in her hand. Most people noticed it only as an old-fashioned ornament, handsome but unfashionably plain beside the jeweled pieces carried by women who wanted to be observed observing. Hers was dark tortoise-shell with a narrow gold hinge, the surface worn smooth where her mother's fingers had held it for years. It belonged to my mother, she said. William's expression altered. The wit did not disappear, but it stepped aside. I did not know. There was no reason you should. Was she fond of it? Very. Francis turned the lorgnette once between her fingers, though I sometimes thought she used it when she did not need to see anything at all. Why? Francis looked toward the long reflection of the glass roof above them. She used to say that distance can make a room easier to understand. William considered that, meaning people behave more honestly when they think they are being watched from farther away. Meaning, one sometimes understands a room better when one is not trying to belong to it. The answer came more personally than Francis intended. She regretted it the moment the words were spoken. Not because they were false, but because truth shared too easily could become another form of exposure. William did not seize upon it. He looked toward the camellia instead. Is that why you prefer standing at the edge? Francis's gaze moved back to him. You have begun observing me. You make it difficult not to. The line might have sounded flirtatious from another man. William said it plainly, almost thoughtfully. That made it more dangerous. Francis folded the lorgnette closed. Watching is safer when rooms have already decided what they think of you. For the first time since he entered, William had no immediate reply. Francis could see him remember the orangery. Weeks earlier, the laughter, his careless sentence, the speed with which Judith had repeated it. She did not rescue him from the memory. He had apologized. She had accepted the apology as an act, not as erasure. That distinction still mattered. And what have the rooms decided? He asked at last. that I am severe when I am precise, difficult when I disagree, proud when I prefer solitude to being patronized. That sounds exhausting. Only when I believe them. William's mouth curved slightly. Do you? Less often than I once did. He glanced at the lorgnette. May I see it? Frances hesitated. The object had been in her possession since her mother's death. She had lent it before, but rarely, and never without a small inward resistance she considered foolish. Still, William had asked rather than reached. She extended it, carefully. Your confidence overwhelms me. It should. He accepted the lorgnette without touching her fingers and lifted it toward the camellia. What am I looking for? The bud nearest the second branch. William leaned slightly. Frances moved closer because the angle was wrong from where he stood. No, lower. I am lower. You are taller. That is not the same thing. He laughed under his breath. She stepped to his side and pointed toward the pale waxen flower. Their shoulders almost touched. The space between them was narrow enough that Frances could feel his warmth through the winter air of the orangery. It was not an embrace, not even contact, yet awareness moved through her with embarrassing clarity. William seemed to feel it too because his breathing changed. Just once, before he adjusted his stance with deliberate care and did not close the remaining distance. There, Frances said, the outer petal has browned slightly. William peered through the lorgnette. I see it. That usually means the night temperature dropped too quickly. I have passed this plant for years. Yes, he lowered the glass and looked at the flower with his own eyes. I never noticed. Frances met his gaze. Perhaps your grace looks too often at rooms and not enough at what grows quietly inside them. The sentence hung between them. William did not laugh. That may be the most charitable criticism you have offered me. I did not intend it charitably. Even better. This time Frances did smile. It was small, but real. William saw it. And something in his expression softened with such unguarded satisfaction that she immediately wished she had looked away sooner. Instead, she remained beside him. He returned the lorgnette carefully, placing it across her open palm without allowing his fingers to linger. Thank you for the instrument, for explaining what I was failing to see. Frances closed her hand around the tortoise shell. That could become a large undertaking. I am beginning to suspect it already is. Before she could answer, voices sounded from the adjoining gallery. Judith entered with Jasper several paces behind her. She wore a deep green morning dress and the composed expression of someone who had already observed more than she intended to admit. Her gaze moved from William to Frances, then to the lorgnette between Frances's fingers. I hope I am not interrupting. You are, Jasper said pleasantly. Judith ignored him. Frances stepped away from William, not because anything improper had occurred, but because society did not require impropriety to manufacture a story. I was showing His Grace the camellia, she said. How educational. Judith's smile was perfect. William's was not. You might try it sometime. Botany has never held me. No, Frances said. It generally requires patience. Jasper covered a laugh with a cough. Judith's eyes cooled. Speaking of patience, I believe mine has been rewarded. I have received letters from London this morning. February is becoming quite crowded. William looked toward her. With what? Masquerades, dinners, concerts, the usual campaign. You make society sound military. It is more dangerous because everyone smiles. Jasper wandered toward the camellias and said, I may require diversion before February. I have been considering whether to renew an old acquaintance. Frances did not like the way his attention settled on her. "Which acquaintance?" she asked. Jasper smiled. "You, Miss Mordaunt." William became very still. Judith looked pleased. Frances, however, felt only a familiar irritation. Jasper had flirted with her once before, casually enough to preserve his dignity when she did not encourage him. Apparently, he had chosen to reinterpret rejection as unfinished business. "There is nothing to renew," she said. Jasper's smile held, though just barely. "London may improve my chances. London is capable of many miracles. I should not rely upon that one." William turned his head, and Frances saw the effort it cost him not to laugh. She appreciated the effort more than the amusement. Jasper bowed lightly. "Then I shall consider myself warned." "Consider yourself answered." Judith touched her brother's arm and steered the conversation elsewhere, but her attention remained fixed on Frances. When Frances left the orangery several minutes later, the lorgnette rested safely in her hand. William watched her go, then looked back at the camellia he had failed to notice for years. Judith watched him noticing. That was enough. By the 6th of January, Larkfield Park had entered the strange pause that comes after Christmas and before departure, when a house is still full but everyone has begun thinking in terms of trunks, routes, engagements, and the people they expect to meet in London. Twelfth Night had brought music, cards, a modest supper, and enough visiting neighbours to keep the drawing rooms bright until late. By the following afternoon, the last of the guests were preparing to leave beneath a sky that threatened rain without quite delivering it. Frances Mordaunt stood beneath the stone portico with the Dowager Duchess, while servants brought around the carriage intended to return them from a short visit to a neighbouring estate. The courtyard stones were dark with winter damp. Frances had tucked her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette safely into her reticule, where it had remained throughout the outing, and she gathered the edge of her cloak as the footman lowered the carriage step. William stood several feet away speaking to Sir Matthew about a horse that had gone lame. Frances noticed him only because he stopped listening halfway through Sir Matthew's sentence. His gaze had shifted toward the carriage. She placed one foot upon the first step. The leather was slick. Her boot moved less than an inch, but enough to make her catch the edge of the door. William was beside her before the footman could react. His hand lifted automatically toward her elbow. Then he stopped. The pause lasted barely a second. Frances saw it anyway. Rather than take hold of her, William turned his hand palm upward between them. "May I?" The question was quiet enough that no one beyond the Dowager Duchess and the footman was likely to hear it. Frances looked at his hand. He wore no glove. She did. The distinction should have made the moment ordinary. It did not. Weeks earlier, he might simply have steadied her and assumed the usefulness of the act excused the assumption behind it. Now he waited. Frances placed her gloved hand in his. Yes, his fingers closed carefully around hers. There was strength in the contact, but no pressure beyond what was necessary to steady her. Frances stepped up into the carriage. For one brief moment before she withdrew her hand, she became acutely aware of how warm his was, despite the cold. William looked up at her. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that had no relation to balance, wet leather, or winter weather. It was not passion. Frances would have distrusted anything that arrived so quickly. It was recognition. He had remembered. He had asked. She had answered. He released her at once. Safer? Marginally. A devastating review of my assistance. You should be grateful I did not call it unnecessary. His mouth curved. I am learning to value small mercies. The Dowager Duchess climbed into the carriage after Francis with considerably less ceremony, and gave her son a look that suggested she had noticed everything while intending to comment on nothing. William stepped back as the door closed. Frances sat opposite the Duchess and folded her hands in her lap. She could still remember the shape of his fingers around hers. That irritated her, not because she had disliked it, because she had liked it enough to remember. The Dowager Duchess adjusted the fur at her collar. The step was badly placed. Frances looked toward the window. "Yes, Your Grace." William did well not to make a spectacle. Frances turned back. The older woman's expression was entirely innocent. "He did. How fortunate." Frances almost smiled. "Your Grace is subtle. Never when subtlety requires effort." The carriage moved on. By evening, the incident should have faded beneath supper, conversation, and the endless discussion of London arrangements. Instead, Frances found herself noticing William's hands whenever he reached for a glass or turned a page. She considered this profoundly inconvenient. Jasper Blythe noticed something too, though not the same thing. After dinner, he found Frances in the drawing room near a table of card players. She was not playing. She had been helping the Dowager Duchess sort a small stack of invitations when Jasper approached with a confidence that suggested their December conversation had not discouraged him so much as challenged his pride. "Miss Mordaunt, you have avoided me all evening." Frances set one invitation aside. "I was not aware I had been assigned the task of finding you." Jasper smiled. "That sounds almost like disappointment." "Then you are hearing very creatively." He took the chair opposite without being invited. Though the Dowager Duchess sat within sight, and several guests were near enough to make the exchange perfectly proper. "London may improve us both." Frances looked at him. "I had not realized you considered yourself in need of improvement." "Everyone improves with an audience. That may explain a great deal." Jasper leaned closer, though not enough to breach propriety. "You dismissed me rather severely in the orangery. I answered you. You answered before I had properly asked. Then, perhaps, you should be grateful. I saved you the trouble." His amusement thinned. "You think I would ask you to marry me?" Frances's expression remained calm. "No, I think you enjoy suggesting that you might, provided the woman behaves sufficiently grateful for the possibility." Jasper's eyes sharpened. "You are very certain of your attractions." "I am certain of my preferences." Across the room, William turned from a conversation with Sir Matthew. He saw Jasper seated opposite Frances and immediately understood enough to dislike it. His first instinct was to cross the room. He stopped himself. Frances did not look distressed. She looked composed, and Jasper looked increasingly uncomfortable. William remained where he was. That decision cost him more than he expected. Jasper lowered his voice. "Then tell me plainly, would you refuse me if I asked?" Frances did not hesitate. "Yes." The word landed softly and absolutely. Jasper stared at her. "You might at least pretend to consider it." "Why?" "Because most women would." "Then you are fortunate to have so many alternatives." A flush rose beneath his cheekbones. "You enjoy humiliating men?" Frances's face cooled. "No, I dislike being asked to protect a man from the consequences of asking a question he does not want," answered. Jasper sat back. For the first time, his charm appeared less natural than practiced. "You refused me once before. I discouraged you once before. You chose to call that ambiguity. And now? Now I am ensuring there is none." Silence held between them. Frances did not look toward William, though she was aware of him across the room. She did not need intervention. She did not want it. Jasper rose. You may discover London less forgiving than Hampshire. London's opinion of me is London's concern, and if society decides you are difficult, Francis's gaze did not waver. Society has survived the discovery before. Jasper bowed with exaggerated correctness. Then I shall leave you to your certainty. Please do. He walked away. Only then did Frances allow herself to breathe more deeply. William stayed where he was for several seconds longer. When their eyes finally met, he did not approach. He simply inclined his head once, acknowledging what she had done without claiming any part of it. Frances felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Judith Blythe, standing near the pianoforte, had watched the entire exchange. Jasper reached her with anger barely concealed beneath his smile. She has refused me twice now. Judith kept her eyes on Frances. Yes, I will not give her the pleasure a third time. Judith's expression changed by almost nothing. You will not need to. Jasper glanced toward William, then back to his sister. What does that mean? Judith saw the Duke still looking across the room toward Frances, not possessively, but with the unmistakable attention of a man discovering that another person's choices mattered to him. It means, she said softly, that your resentment may finally be useful. Sewer, by the 20th of January, Larkfield Park had begun to sound like a house preparing to empty itself. Trunks moved along upper corridors. Footmen carried lists between the steward's room and the entrance hall. Horses were discussed in terms of stages and weather, and every conversation seemed eventually to reach London. Frances Mordaunt should have been thinking about the journey. Instead, she stood in the conservatory beside a long table of winter plants, wondering why William Somerville had asked whether he might speak with her before the household departed. The doors to the adjoining morning room remained open. Through them came the soft turn of pages as the Dowager Duchess read beside the fire, close enough for propriety and far enough to grant them the dignity of conversation. William stood opposite Frances beneath the pale January light. He had abandoned the easy smile he wore in company. That alone made her attentive. You look very serious, she said. I have been accused of that before. Not by me. No, you generally accuse me of the opposite. Frances almost smiled, only when evidence supports the charge. His mouth moved, but the humor did not fully arrive. He glanced toward the glass roof, where a thin wash of daylight showed the bare branches beyond. I have been thinking about something you said. That sounds dangerous. It may be. He looked back at her. You said honesty without freedom is only another form of obedience. Frances remembered the words. She had spoken them during a discussion 2 evenings earlier, when Jasper had made some careless remark about husbands being entitled to peace in their own homes. She had not expected William to carry the sentence away with him. I meant it, she said. I know. His voice was quieter now. That is why it stayed with me. Frances rested one hand against the edge of the table. Her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette was tucked safely into her reticule, which hung from her wrist. She did not reach for it. Somehow using it now would have felt like placing glass between herself and whatever William was about to say. He took a breath. My parents were considered very well matched. Frances waited. William's father, the late Duke of Norchester, had been dead several years. She knew little more. Society rarely described ducal marriages except through settlements, heirs, and appearances. They never argued in public, William continued. They rarely disagreed in private, where anyone could hear them. My mother performed every duty expected of her. My father performed every duty expected of him. Their dinners were elegant. Their household ran properly. Their portraits look excellent together. Francis heard what he was not saying, and they were unhappy. I am not certain unhappy is even the right word. William looked toward the open doors of the morning room, not because he feared his mother would hear, but because speaking of her marriage while she sat nearby seemed to require care. They became strangers who knew one another's schedules. I cannot remember my father asking my mother what she wanted, unless the answer affected an estate arrangement. I cannot remember her contradicting him after the first few years of their marriage. Francis's expression softened despite herself. Perhaps she learned it did no good. I think she learned peace was cheaper. That sentence carried more bitterness than anything William had said before. He exhaled slowly. When I was younger, I decided marriage was simply that. Two people performing agreement until neither remembered what they might have said if disagreement were allowed. Francis studied him. The witty Duke, who could turn discomfort into amusement, had disappeared. In his place stood a man who looked almost uncertain of the ground beneath his feet. "And so you mock it first," she said. William's eyes met hers. Yes, there was no defense in the answer. If I make marriage ridiculous, then I do not have to admit that I am afraid of becoming my father. Francis felt something tighten quietly inside her. He had spoken of fear without disguising it as philosophy. She knew enough about powerful men to understand how rarely they named fear at all. "You are not your father," she said. "No, but I possess the same advantages he did. Rank, money, a house full of people trained to obey before I finish asking." His mouth twisted. "Sometimes I do not even ask." Francis thought of the carriage step, of his hand stopping before it touched her, of the small question that had mattered far more than the danger of slipping. "Sometimes you do." He looked at her then. The silence between them changed. William stepped no closer. "When I made that remark about you in this house, I told myself it was wit. The truth is more embarrassing. That usually means it is closer to the truth. You made marriage sound as though it required courage." Francis did not move. "It does. Yes." His voice dropped, and I disliked being reminded that I might not possess enough of it. For a moment, there was only the faint sound of the Dowager Duchess turning another page in the morning room. Francis could have answered lightly. Several weeks earlier, she probably would have. Instead, she said, "Courage is not the same as certainty." "I know. And marriage should not require one person to become smaller so the other can feel safe." "I know that too." He gave a humorless little smile. "At least I am beginning to." Francis looked down at his hands. They were bare. He had removed his gloves before entering the conservatory, though she had not noticed when. William followed her gaze. Very slowly, he turned one hand palm upward between them. He did not extend it far enough to demand anything. He simply opened it. Francis looked at him. "What are you asking?" "Nothing you cannot refuse. That is not an answer." "No." His eyes held hers. "May I hold your hand?" The directness of it startled her more than flirtation would have. There was no ballroom to excuse the touch. No carriage step, no social requirement. If she placed her hand in his now, it would mean only that she wished to. Francis became acutely aware of the open doors, the quiet presence of the Dowager Duchess beyond them, the winter light across William's face, and the fact that his hand remained still. Waiting, she could refuse. He would accept it. Somehow that certainty made consent easier rather than less significant. Francis slipped one glove free, finger by finger. William did not move. She placed her bare hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with deliberate gentleness. Warmth spread through her palm. Neither spoke. Frances had expected self-consciousness. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar quiet. William did not raise her hand. He did not draw her nearer. He simply held it as though the stillness itself mattered. After several breaths, his thumb moved once across the side of her finger, then stopped. As if even that small motion had required permission he did not wish to presume upon. Frances could have withdrawn. She did not. Instead, she tightened her fingers around his. William's gaze lifted sharply to hers. Something unguarded passed across his face. Not triumph. Relief, that mattered. "You understand," Frances said softly, "that wanting someone does not give you a claim upon them." "Yes, even if they want you too." His breath caught almost imperceptibly. "Do they?" Frances felt warmth rise beneath her skin, but she refused to retreat into coyness. "I said even if." William's smile returned, small and careful. "Cruel woman, you have survived worse." Barely. This time Frances smiled fully. Their hands remained joined. Neither needed to pretend the moment was accidental. Beyond the conservatory, a carriage rolled across the gravel, reminding them that London was approaching whether either was ready or not. William looked toward the sound, then back at her. "The journey begins in 3 days. I know. London will be louder than this. London is always louder than necessary. And there will be more people determined to misunderstand you." Frances's expression sharpened. "Do not make the mistake of believing I need you to stop them." "I will try not to. Try harder than that." His fingers tightened once around hers, answering the pressure she had given him before. "I will." Frances believed he meant it. That frightened her more than if she had not. At last she withdrew her hand. William let it go immediately. No reluctance became restraint. No tenderness became possession. Frances pulled her glove back on and looked through the open doors toward the waiting house. Neither of them knew that while Larkfield prepared trunks and carriage, Roots, a second silver-grey domino, was already being finished in London for a woman who had no intention of wearing her own face when the time came. The journey from Hampshire to London had taken place without incident, but by the 6th of February Frances Mordaunt had begun to think that arriving safely at Norchester House was the least dangerous part of the season. The masquerade filled William's Mayfair residence with candlelight, music, silk, and deliberate uncertainty. Masks altered faces, dominoes blurred rank, and every corridor seemed to hold a second conversation behind the first. Frances wore the silver-grey domino she had chosen at Larkfield Park, plain except for a narrow fall at the shoulders and a half-mask that left her mouth uncovered. Her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette remained secured inside her reticule. She had decided a masquerade offered enough artificial distance without requiring another instrument through which to observe it. Across the ballroom, Lady Judith Blythe was impossible to mistake. She wore black silk with silver embroidery and the same 3 black ostrich plumes, wound at the quills with fine silver wire. They rose above her dark headdress whenever she moved beneath the chandeliers. Lord Jasper Blythe stood near her in a dark domino, his mask doing little to disguise the self-satisfaction Frances had learned to recognize without assistance. William, meanwhile, had chosen restraint. His evening coat was black, his domino dark blue, and his mask simple enough that half the room identified him within 10 minutes. "You have failed at disguise," Frances told him when the movement of a country dance brought them briefly near one another. I was not aware I had attempted it. Then you have succeeded completely. His eyes warmed behind the mask. London has improved your mercy. London has done no such thing. Good. I feared losing one of your better qualities. Frances felt the answering smile before she permitted it. Their last conversation at Larkfield remained between them in a way no one else could see. She remembered his open hand in the conservatory. She remembered choosing to place hers in it. He had not referred to the moment since, and the restraint made it more intimate rather than less. Before she could reply, the Dowager Duchess appeared at the edge of the dancers with one hand pressed lightly against her ribs. Frances noticed at once that her colour had faded. Your Grace, she left the figure as soon as propriety allowed and crossed to her. It's nothing, the older woman said. Too much heat and too little sense in the room. William joined them, concern replacing amusement. Mother, you're pale. I am also surrounded by people determined to tell me so. Frances ignored the complaint. The small withdrawing room off the East Gallery will be quieter. The Dowager Duchess nodded. William started to offer his arm, but his mother waved him away. Stay here. Half these people came to stare at you. Do not disappoint them all at once. Frances said, I'll go with her. William looked at Frances, then at his mother. Send for me if she worsens. I'm standing beside you. The Dowager said, You needn't discuss me as if I've expired. Frances took the older woman's arm only after she offered it. Together they left the ballroom and moved through the East Gallery towards a smaller room where the windows could be opened slightly and the noise fell to a distant murmur. A maid brought water. Frances remained with the Dowager, while the heat left her face and her breathing settled. Neither woman knew that, almost at the same moment, Judith Blythe slipped through a different door on the far side of the ballroom. Jasper followed several minutes later. Judith entered a dressing room set aside for female guests and found the parcel already waiting beneath a folded shawl. She dismissed her dresser earlier than usual, claiming that the mask gave her a headache, and she needed privacy. Within minutes, the black silk and silver embroidery were hidden beneath a travelling cloak. The duplicate silver-grey domino fell around her shoulders almost exactly as Frances's did. A second half mask covered the upper part of her face. Judith removed the headdress with its 3 black plumes and carried it with her rather than leave it where a maid might notice. Her height was close enough to Frances's for candlelight and distance to do the rest. She stepped into the dim service passage behind the gallery. Jasper was waiting. You took long enough, he murmured. If you wanted efficiency, you should have chosen a crime requiring no buttons. You're enjoying this. No, I am correcting an inconvenience. They entered the side gallery, through a narrow door used by servants carrying refreshments. Jasper placed himself where the opening screen cast both their figures into partial shadow. Judith stood close to him, closer than convention permitted between an unmarried woman and a man who was not her relative. She tilted her masked face toward his. Nothing improper happened. Nothing needed to. 2 gentlemen crossing from the card room saw them. A lady following several steps behind saw enough to slow. One of the gentlemen recognized Jasper's voice when he said, deliberately louder than necessary, You refused me in Hampshire. I'm glad London has made you reconsider. Judith turned away as though startled to have been discovered. The movement completed the illusion. Silver-grey fabric, Frances's height, Jasper's known interest, a masked woman retreating from him. That was all society required to build certainty. Judith slipped back into the service passage before anyone could approach. In her haste, the black headdress she carried brushed against a carved panel. One of the ostrich plumes caught at the lower quill. She pulled. The feather tore free and remained wedged against the dark wood. Silver wire still wound around its broken base. Judith did not notice. By the time she regained the dressing room, restored the black costume, and returned to the ballroom wearing only 2 plumes, the first whisper had already crossed 3 groups of guests. Frances, still unaware, was helping the Dowager Duchess return slowly toward the ballroom. "You're certain you should go back?" she asked. "If I remain absent, William will empty the house and summon every physician in London." "That seems excessive. He is a duke. Excess is one of the few follies society encourages in him." Frances smiled, but the expression faded when they entered the main gallery. Conversation stopped too quickly. People looked away too carefully. One woman stared openly at Frances's silver-grey domino. Frances felt the atmosphere before she understood it. William reached her first. His face was controlled, but anger lived beneath the control. Not anger at her. She knew that before he spoke. Jasper stood several yards away with Judith beside him. Judith now wore 2 black plumes, though Frances had no reason yet to count them. "What has happened?" Frances asked. William lowered his voice. "Several people claim they saw you in the West Gallery with Jasper." Frances stared at him. "I was with your mother. I know where you were for part of the evening." The words were factual, not accusing. "I need to ask you plainly, were you in that gallery with him?" Frances heard the question beneath the question. He was giving her the dignity of answering before he accepted anyone else's version of what they had seen. "No." William did not hesitate. "Then you were not." Something inside Frances loosened. She had not realized how tightly it had drawn until then. Around them, whispers continued. Jasper lifted one shoulder when Sir Matthew asked whether he wished to correct the growing implication. "I have nothing to say." Frances turned toward him. "You have a great deal to say if you know the woman was not me." Jasper's smile was almost apologetic. "Masks create confusion, only for people who find confusion useful," Judith said softly. "Frances, perhaps this isn't the place." It became the place when someone decided to make it one. Several guests had drawn nearer. William saw the circle forming. He saw the hunger in it. Frances had been turned into spectacle once before under his roof in Hampshire, and he would not allow it again. The decision arrived with the same dangerous speed that had governed too much of his life. He believed her. He wanted the room to stop. He wanted every whisper extinguished before it could become tomorrow's certainty. He did not stop to ask what Frances wanted. He stepped forward and spoke clearly enough for the nearest groups to hear. "There can be no question of impropriety. Miss Mordaunt is to be my wife." Silence fell so completely that even the musicians seemed to falter. Frances looked at him. The relief she had felt vanished. William saw the change in her face and understood, one instant too late, that believing her had not given him the right to decide for her. "No, Your Grace, I have agreed to nothing." Frances's voice was not loud, yet it carried through the stunned circle more cleanly than William's announcement had. For one suspended instant, no one moved. The musicians had stopped. A gentleman near the gallery entrance lowered his glass without drinking. Lady Judith Blythe stood with 2 black plumes rising above her headdress and an expression of practiced concern. Jasper looked almost pleased. William heard only Frances. She faced him in her silver-grey domino, the half-mask still covering the upper part of her face. But there was no mistaking what had changed in her gaze. Minutes earlier, she had trusted him because he had accepted her word without hesitation. He had taken that trust and used it as permission to decide the next sentence of her life. Frances, he said, then stopped. Even her Christian name felt too intimate when he had just presumed so much in public. She removed her mask. The gesture was calm, deliberate, and devastating. You believed my word and then replaced it with yours. William felt the truth of it before the room had time to understand the accusation. Yes, he said. He could have explained that he had meant to shield her. He could have said scandal worked quickly, that Jasper's silence was poisonous, that a duke's declared intention might stop gossip before dawn. Every defense available to him depended upon the same error. He had assumed his judgment of what would protect Frances mattered more than Frances's judgment of what she wanted. I was wrong. Judith stepped forward with exquisite caution. Surely this can be discussed privately. Miss Mordaunt is understandably distressed. Frances turned toward her. I am not confused, Lady Judith. I did not say you were. You suggested my refusal should be treated as emotion rather than meaning. Judith's smile tightened. Frances looked back at William. I will not accept an engagement because a room finds it convenient. You should not. His answer came immediately. That startled several people more than her refusal had. Jasper gave a soft laugh. This grows more extraordinary by the moment. William turned on him. You will remain silent. Jasper's brows rose. Your Grace just announced a marriage that does not exist. I am hardly the greatest source of confusion here. William wanted to strike the smugness from his voice, with rank, anger, anything. He did neither. Jasper was correct about one fact, and William would not hide from it, simply because the man delighted in saying it. No, William said. You are not. The Dowager Duchess stepped beside Frances. Her color had improved, though fatigue still showed at the edges of her face. My dear, would you like to leave? Frances looked at her, and gratitude moved briefly through her expression. Yes, Your Grace. The Dowager offered her arm. Frances accepted because the offer was hers to accept. William took one instinctive step forward, then stopped himself. May I arrange the carriage? Frances met his eyes. Your mother already has one. It was not cruel. That made it worse. Of course, he stepped aside. No one attempted to stop them as Frances and the Dowager Duchess crossed the ballroom. People parted in silence. Frances did not hurry, lower her head, or conceal her face again. She carried the silver-grey mask in one hand and left the room as herself. William watched until the doors closed behind her. Judith exhaled softly. This evening has become unfortunate for everyone. William looked at her. Not everyone. Her gaze sharpened. I beg your pardon. Someone manufactured the appearance of Miss Mordaunt in that gallery. Jasper has chosen not to deny what he knows. Someone benefits from the confusion. Jasper's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Are you accusing us? No. William's voice was cold now. I am refusing to accuse Frances. He turned to the remaining guests. This gathering is over. No one argued. Rank could be misused. But it could also end a spectacle when enough damage had been done. By midnight, Norchester House had emptied of all but family, servants, and the guests staying beneath its roof. Frances did not remain. The Dowager Duchess accompanied her in person to the respectable London residence, where Frances had rooms under the roof of Mrs. Eleanor Wickland, an old acquaintance of her late mother. Frances said little during the drive. The city outside the carriage windows was dark and damp, lamps trembling in the mist. Her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette remained secure in her reticule. She had not lost anything physical that night. The injury was harder to measure. William had believed her. That mattered. Then he had tried to transform belief into possession before an audience. That mattered more. "He knew the instant you spoke," the Dowager Duchess said at last. Francis looked across the carriage. Knowing after the words are said does not unsay them. No, the older woman did not defend her son. It does not. Francis stared toward the dark window. I thought he had learned to ask. So did he. That is not the same as having learned. The Dowager Duchess nodded once. No. Francis appreciated her for leaving the truth untouched. The following morning, William rose before 7, having slept very little. He refused the first draft of a message his secretary prepared for calls that would inevitably arrive. It was too polished, too careful, too much like an attempt to preserve his dignity. By 10 o'clock, the guests who had witnessed the previous evening's scene were received in the morning room in small groups. William did not summon Francis. He did not send flowers. He did not ask his mother to persuade her to return. He corrected the public fact where he had created it. "There is no engagement between Miss Mordaunt and me," he said to Sir Matthew Hale, Mrs. Holbury, Lady Judith, Jasper, and the other principal witnesses. "My statement last night was made without Miss Mordaunt's consent. She had not agreed to marry me. She had not been asked. The error was entirely mine." Mrs. Holbury blinked. "But your Grace meant to protect her reputation. My intention does not alter what I did." Judith's expression remained delicately sympathetic. "You acted under considerable pressure." William looked at her. "Miss Mordaunt was under pressure. I acted." The distinction silenced the room. Jasper leaned back in his chair, and the gallery. Miss Mordaunt denied being there. "I believe her, on no evidence but her word." William's gaze hardened. "Her word is evidence of what she says she did. Society may require more. Then society may wait while facts are established." Judith gave a quiet sigh. "Poor Francis. She will find this difficult to survive." William heard the choice of phrase. "Poor Francis," as though the woman were already a ruin being discussed politely. "Miss Mordaunt is not a casualty for you to mourn in advance." Judith's smile vanished. The meeting ended shortly afterward. William remained behind with his mother. The Dowager Duchess waited until the door closed before saying, "You did correctly this morning what you should have done last night. That is an elegant way of saying I made a disaster and then labeled it accurately. Accuracy is a beginning, not an absolution." "No." He looked toward the empty fireplace. "I do not know how to repair what I did without making another decision for her." His mother studied him. "Then perhaps you should begin by making none." William gave a tired laugh. "You make restraint sound simple." "It is simple. That does not make it easy." A knock interrupted them. The housekeeper entered, carrying a folded cloth in both hands. "Your Grace, one of the housemaids found this late last night near the service passage off the West Gallery. I thought it might belong to one of the ladies." She opened the cloth. Inside lay a black ostrich plume, torn at the lower quill. Fine silver wire still wound around its base. William stared at it. He had seen 3 such plumes at the beginning of the masquerade. He remembered Judith returning to the ballroom after the whispers began. He remembered, too, for the first time since Francis had walked away from him, regret gave way to something colder. A question. By the 12th of February, the black plume had ceased to look like an ornament and begun to look like a question. William could not ignore. For 6 days, it remained where the housekeeper had placed it after the masquerade, wrapped in clean cloth, and kept in the small cabinet beside the Dowager Duchess's escritoire at Norchester House. William had refused to carry it away himself. He had already made one disastrous decision, because he believed his urgency entitled him to act first. This time, he meant to move only as quickly as the facts permitted. The housekeeper showed him the precise place where the maid had found it. Caught low against the carved panel beside the service passage, leading from the west gallery, the quill was torn near the base. Fine silver wire still wound around it in narrow, deliberate turns. William remembered 3 black plumes above Judith Blythe's head when the masquerade began. He remembered 2 when she stood beside Jasper as Francis returned to the ballroom. Memory was not proof, but it was enough to justify a question. Who dressed Lady Judith that evening? He asked his mother later that morning. The Dowager Duchess looked up from the plume lying on the cloth between them. Her own dresser, I assume. Did you notice when she left the ballroom? No, I was too occupied with feeling faint and pretending I was not. William winced. I should have noticed sooner. Do not turn every failure of observation into a confession. It becomes tedious. He almost smiled. You noticed the feathers. I noticed them because Judith had worn the same 3 at Larkfield. Her gaze sharpened. You think one was lost while she was somewhere she should not have been. I think it is possible. And what will you do? William looked at the plume. Ask questions that do not require Francis to surrender anything. His mother's expression softened by a degree. Better. The first useful answer came not from the household, but from a modiste in Bond Street, who had supplied several masquerade garments to families William knew. He went without liveried display, accompanied only by his secretary, and asked to see the order record for silver-grey dominoes delivered in the fortnight. Before the 6th of February, the modiste was cautious until William made clear he was not requesting the names of every woman in London who had ordered grey silk. He wanted only to know whether 2 garments matching a particular description had been made, when he had reason to believe there should have been one. The woman turned several pages of her account book. Her fingers stopped. There were 2, Your Grace. William felt something inside him grow still. Ordered by the same customer. Not directly. She showed him the entry. 1 silver-grey domino had been commissioned openly for Miss Frances Mordaunt. The second, nearly identical in cut and shade, had been ordered later through a servant who gave a delivery direction associated with House of Blythe. No name of a lady appeared. Was there any unusual request? William asked. Only that the second garment match the first as closely as possible and bear no embroidery or distinctive trimming. The modiste hesitated. I thought it strange. Masquerade dress usually invites distinction. Do you remember who collected it? A footman, I believe. I can have my clerk verify the notation. Do that. William did not take the ledger. He did not demand private correspondence. He requested a written confirmation of that single transaction, nothing more. By the 20th of February, he had the relevant statement in his possession and no explanation from Judith that he trusted enough to ask for yet. He had not confronted her. He had learned with difficulty that a premature accusation could ruin truth as efficiently as a lie. That afternoon, he sent a formal note to Mrs. Eleanor Wickland requesting permission to call upon Miss Mordaunt. The reply permitted a visit at 3. Francis received him in a modest but elegant drawing room overlooking a narrow London garden. Mrs. Wickland sat near the window with embroidery in her lap. close enough to satisfy propriety and tactful enough to become deeply interested in blue silk thread. Frances wore a dark green day dress. Her mother's tortoise shell lorgnette rested folded on the small table beside her. William noticed it and immediately remembered the conservatory at Larkfield, her bare hand in his, the trust he had damaged only weeks later. He did not allow himself to look at her hand now. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. Frances inclined her head. "You asked rather than arrived." The words were mild, but he understood them. "I am trying not to confuse access with permission again." Something moved in her expression, too brief to name. "What have you found?" William laid no dramatic evidence before her. He simply told her the sequence. The plume had been found near the West Gallery service passage. The Dowager Duchess remembered Judith wearing 3 at Larkfield and again at the beginning of the masquerade. William remembered seeing only 2 later. A London modiste had confirmed that a second silver-grey domino, nearly identical to Frances's, had been commissioned through a servant connected to House of Blythe shortly before the masquerade. "That proves planning," Frances said. "It proves a second costume was deliberately ordered," William replied. "It does not yet prove who wore it." Frances studied him. "You would once have completed that sentence for me." "I know, and told me what conclusion I should reach." "Probably. You sound almost ashamed of your efficiency." "I am becoming suspicious of any efficiency that requires another person to become silent." Mrs. Wickland's needle paused near the window. Frances noticed but did not smile. "Who has the plume now?" "My mother. It has remained in her cabinet since the housekeeper delivered it." "Keep it there." "You do not want it brought to you?" "No. If this becomes public, I do not want anyone claiming I possessed the object before its significance was established. Nor should you carry it from house to house, as though evidence becomes safer because a duke touches it." William accepted the correction without flinching. "Then it remains with my mother, and the modiste's confirmation, with my secretary's papers at Norchester House. You may see it whenever you choose." Frances was silent for a moment. "You believe Judith was involved?" "I believe the evidence points toward House of Blythe. I do not yet know the complete path from the second domino to the gallery. And Jasper, his refusal to deny the implication remains suspicious, but suspicion is not the same as proof." Frances leaned back slightly. William recognized the look she wore when she was deciding whether a person deserved another inch of trust. "That is an improvement," she said. "It is a humiliatingly low standard. You established it yourself." I remember. There was no self-pity in his voice. That mattered more than an elaborate apology would have. Frances asked what he intended to do next. William answered, "Nothing without telling you what I know first. That is not the same as asking what I want." He held her gaze. "No, it is not." He did not rush to repair the sentence. "What do you want now?" Frances looked toward Mrs. Weakland, then back at him. "I want facts, not rescue, not another announcement. If a servant is involved, I want no one threatened into speaking for my sake." "Agreed. And if I tell you to stop calling, you stop." "Yes." She studied him another moment, then nodded. The movement was small, but William felt it with more force than society's loudest approval. They spoke for several minutes more about timing. Nothing intimate, nothing that pretended the rupture between them had vanished. Then Frances glanced toward the clock. "That is enough for today." William rose immediately. "Of course." As he turned, he noticed the tortoise-shell lorgnette had shifted near the edge of the small table, close enough that Frances might knock it with her sleeve when she stood. He moved it only a few inches inward and placed it within easy reach of her hand. He did not touch her. He did not comment on the gesture. Francis looked at the lorgnette, then at him. The old William might have lingered to read gratitude into her silence. This William bowed. "Good afternoon, Miss Mordaunt." "Good afternoon, Your Grace." He left when asked. Francis remained still after the door closed. Looking at the lorgnette he had returned to reach without using the moment to claim closeness. For the first time since the masquerade, the possibility of trusting him again did not feel like surrender. Across Mayfair that same afternoon, a folded note reached Lady Judith Blythe. It contained only one sentence from a servant who had heard more than he should have at a Bond Street shop. Someone from Norchester House had been asking about a second silver-grey domino. On the 2nd of March, the first sign of spring came to London as a pale warmth against the windows of Norchester House, though nothing inside William Somerville's morning room felt gentle. Lady Judith Blythe's dresser sat rigidly on the edge of a chair, twisting a handkerchief between both hands. The Dowager Duchess occupied the seat beside the hearth. William remained standing. He had learned enough in the past month not to loom over frightened people merely because rank made it easy. "You asked to speak with my mother," he said. "You may do so freely. No one here will punish you for telling the truth." The young woman swallowed. "Your Grace, I don't want to lose my place. You will not lose a respectable reference from this house because you answered a question honestly." The Dowager Duchess added, "Nor will anyone be permitted to threaten you through mine." That steadied her. On the night of the masquerade, Lady Judith sent me away from her dressing room. William's attention sharpened. "For how long?" "Nearly an hour, Your Grace. She said the mask had given her a headache, and she wanted no fuss. When I left her, she was dressed in black. All 3 plumes were fixed to the headdress. I know because I pinned the last one myself." The dowager's gaze moved briefly toward William. He did not interrupt. "And when you returned?" he asked. "She was in black again, but there were only 2 plumes. I asked if one had fallen. She told me not to be tedious. Did you see any silver-grey garment?" The dresser hesitated. "No, Your Grace, but a travelling cloak had been moved, and the room smelled of the pomade she uses when she changes her hair quickly." William kept his voice level. "You did not see her wearing the duplicate domino?" "No." "Then we will not say that you did." Relief crossed the woman's face. It was a small thing, but William understood its importance. Truth became fragile when powerful people asked witnesses to improve it. The second witness was a footman from Norchester House, who had been carrying a tray through the West Service passage. During the masquerade, he remembered stepping aside for a masked woman in silver-grey. He had assumed she was Frances because of the costume and build. He had also remembered something else. She came from the small dressing corridor, Your Grace. Not from the ballroom. Could Miss Mordaunt have reached that passage from the room where she was attending my mother? Not without crossing the East Gallery, going down the secondary stair, and coming around behind the West Wing. It would have taken time. The Dowager Duchess said, "And Frances remained with me until I returned toward the ballroom." The footman nodded. "Yes, Your Grace. I saw you both near the East Gallery afterward." That did not prove every movement of Judith Blythe, but it closed the gap enough to make the sequence coherent. A duplicate costume had been commissioned through House of Blythe. A silver-grey woman had used the service route. Judith had been absent from her dresser for nearly an hour. She began the evening with 3 black plumes and returned with 2. The missing plume had been found caught beside that same root. William did not feel triumph. He felt anger disciplined into purpose. Nothing further is to be asked of either witness without their consent, he told his mother, and neither is to be exposed before a room full of people merely because society enjoys spectacle. The Dowager Duchess looked at him for a long moment. You have changed your method. I am trying to change more than that. That afternoon he called upon Frances at Mrs. Wickland's house with the full sequence in his mind and no speech prepared for her. Frances received him in the same drawing room as before. Her mother's tortoiseshell lorgnette rested closed beside a small stack of botanical notes. She did not touch it when he entered. William took the chair offered to him and told her everything. He distinguished what the dresser had seen from what she had inferred. He distinguished what the footman remembered from what the evidence suggested. When he finished, Frances was silent. So Judith disappeared, she said at last. A second silver-grey domino existed. A woman wearing it used the west passage. Judith returned missing 1 plume, and that plume was found there. Yes, and Jasper helped create the impression that the woman was me. Yes. Frances looked toward the window. It is enough to expose the lie. I believe so. William waited. The old instinct rose in him, demanding action. Invite the witnesses. Summon the same guests. Force a public correction before another day passed. He let the instinct die unanswered. What do you want? He asked. Frances turned back to him. The question affected her more deeply than he expected. He saw it in the brief stillness of her face. You are asking me? Yes. Not telling me what would be wisest. No. Not arranging it before I answer. No. William's voice softened. What do you want, Frances? She drew a slow breath. I want the truth corrected before the same people who judged me. Not in every drawing room in London. Not through gossip answered with more gossip. The people who watched that night should hear what actually happened. Agreed. The dresser and the footman are not to be paraded before them like exhibits. Agreed. If they speak, they do so because they choose to, and their employment is protected. My mother and I have already given that assurance. Something eased in her expression. Good. You should lead the questions. Frances studied him. You would give me the room? It is your name they injured, and your house. That does not make the truth mine. She looked down at her hands. William knew he should leave the conversation there, but one thing remained between them that evidence could not repair. There is something else I owe you. Frances raised her eyes. You have apologized. Not precisely enough. He did not look away. At the masquerade, I believed you. Then I decided that because I believed you, I had the right to solve the consequences. I defended your name by spending your choice. Frances's face changed. William continued before courage deserted him. I made marriage into a shield and held it over you without asking whether you wanted it. I made your future public property in the very act of claiming to protect you from that. I was wrong. Silence filled the room. Mrs. Wickland sat farther away near the window, present but tactfully absorbed in correspondence. Frances said, and if I had accepted because I felt trapped by what you announced. William's jaw tightened. Then I would have obtained the answer I wanted by making refusal harder. I do not know that I could have forgiven myself for that. Would you have married me? Yes, the answer came without hesitation, but that would not have made what I did honorable. Frances held his gaze. You understand that now? I do. And if I never forgive you, his expression hurt, but he did not hide from the question. then I will still correct what I did. That answer reached her where explanations had not. For weeks, Frances had watched him alter his behavior without knowing whether she would reward the change. He had left when asked. He had not used evidence as an excuse for intimacy. He had corrected the false engagement publicly before knowing whether she would ever speak warmly to him again. Now he sat before her with no demand disguised as remorse. "Stand up," she said. William blinked. "What? Stand up?" He obeyed. Frances rose too. For one uncertain second they faced each other. Then she stepped forward. William did not move. Frances lifted her arms and placed them around him. Only then did he embrace her. His hands settled carefully at her back, holding without pulling. Frances closed her eyes. The embrace was warm, steady, and entirely chosen. It contained apology, forgiveness not yet complete, and something deeper neither of them had named. William's breath moved against her hair. He did not kiss her. He did not ask for more. When Frances drew back, he released her immediately. "There is something else I want to ask you," he said softly. Her heart gave one hard beat. "Then ask." William shook his head. "Not yet. Not while scandal might make your answer feel compulsory." Frances looked at him for a long moment. "You are learning, painfully. Good." The corner of her mouth lifted. Some lessons deserve effort. Outside, London remained grey, but sunlight had begun to reach the upper windows. William looked toward the closed lorgnette on the table, then back at Frances. "May I call again?" "Yes." "With no evidence?" "Preferably." For the first time since the masquerade, they both smiled. Across town, Judith Blythe was telling Jasper that denial would be enough. She had not yet understood that Frances would no longer enter the next room as the woman being defended. She would enter it as the woman asking the questions. On the 22nd of March, William Somerville arrived at Mrs. Wickland's house with no papers in his pocket, no witness statement waiting to be discussed, and no plan for repairing anyone's reputation. For the first time in weeks, he had come to see Frances Mordaunt with nothing to offer except himself. The realization made him more nervous than any public confrontation had managed. Spring had begun to soften London at the edges. Pale light rested on the drawing-room windows, and a vase of early narcissus stood beside the hearth. Frances was seated near the window, with botanical notes spread across a small table. Her mother's tortoiseshell lorgnette lay closed beside them. When William entered, she looked first at his empty hands. "No evidence?" she asked. "No witnesses?" "None. No scandal?" "I have made a heroic effort to arrive without one." Her mouth curved. "Then you may sit down, Mrs." Wickland occupied a chair at the far side of the room, close enough for propriety and sufficiently absorbed in correspondence to make conversation possible. William took the chair opposite Frances. For several seconds neither spoke. They had discussed truth, injury, choice, and public consequence. Somehow an ordinary silence felt more intimate. Frances broke it first. "What did you wish to speak about?" William looked at her. "You. That sounds dangerously broad. I have rehearsed several clever openings. I hope you abandoned them. Completely." She waited. He felt the old instinct to hide uncertainty behind wit and deliberately refused it. "I love you, Frances." The room seemed to become very still. Frances's expression did not change at once, but her fingers stopped against the edge of her notebook. William continued, before fear could persuade him to decorate the truth. "I love the way you notice what everyone else walks past. I love that you tell me when I am wrong and do not apologize for having seen it. I love that you can stand in a room determined to misunderstand you and remain yourself anyway." Frances' eyes glistened, though she did not look away. William. It was the first time she had spoken his Christian name without anger or urgency. He heard it as a gift. "I used to think marriage required a woman to enter a man's life and arrange herself around what was already there," he said. "I thought that was what husbands did. They inherited houses, habits, expectations, and then expected a wife to fit among them." He gave a small, rueful smile. "You have made that idea seem both foolish and unbearably lonely." Frances's voice was soft. "And what do you think now?" "That I want a life large enough for two complete people." He leaned forward slightly, though he did not reach for her. "I do not want you quieter. I do not want you easier. I do not want you grateful. I want you exactly as you are, even when what you are telling me is inconvenient. Especially then, I am trying not to be reckless." "Coward," he laughed, and this time the laughter carried no defense. Frances looked down briefly. When she raised her eyes again, there was no caution left in them, only feeling. "And I love you." William did not move. The words struck him with such force that movement seemed impossible. Frances smiled faintly. "You may breathe." He did. "I was not certain I remembered how." "You will need the skill. For marriage, for surviving disagreement." He smiled, but her expression grew serious again. "Do not ask me, because you once said no man should." William understood at once. The first insult still existed, so did the false engagement. Love did not erase either. "I am not asking because I once mocked the idea," he said, "and I am not asking because society injured you." He held her gaze. "I ask because I have become the man who hopes you might." Frances became very still. William rose, but he did not kneel. He had no wish to turn her answer into theatre, even in a quiet drawing room. "Frances Mordaunt, will you marry me?" She let the question remain between them long enough to make its freedom unmistakable. William did not fill the silence. He did not persuade. Frances stood. "Yes." The single word changed his face so completely that she laughed through sudden tears. William smiled, but he still did not touch her. "May I kiss you?" Frances looked at him for one heartbeat. "Yes." She closed half the distance herself. William met her gently. The kiss was warm, careful, and unmistakably chosen. There was no urgency in it, no attempt to claim what had been offered. Frances rested one hand lightly against his coat, while his hand settled at her waist only after she moved closer. When they parted, they remained near enough to hear one another breathe. William touched his forehead briefly to hers. "I had intended to say something memorable after that. You have already exhausted your supply of speeches. Cruel woman, you appear tolerably pleased about it." "I am." Frances smiled, and this time kissed him again first. It was brief, affectionate, and enough to make William's expression turn almost boyishly astonished. "For accuracy," she said, "I wished to make my position clear. Your position is becoming one of my favorite subjects." Mrs. Wickland made a discreet sound with a letter several yards away. Frances stepped back, laughing softly. "You should tell your mother?" William's smile deepened. "I asked her to be nearby this afternoon in case I was fortunate enough to need her." Frances raised one brow. "That sounds dangerously like preparation." "I prepared for your freedom to say no. Better." The Dowager Duchess arrived less than half an hour later. She entered carrying no triumphant expression, only a small velvet case in both hands. When Frances told her the news herself, the older woman embraced her and said, "I am very glad," entirely selfishly. William looked offended. "You could mention me." You are the least surprising element in this room. She placed the velvet case on the table. This belongs to House of Somerville. It has remained in my keeping because no woman has had cause to wear it for some years. William opened the case. Inside lay the Norchester garnet betrothal ring, old-fashioned and elegant, a deep red stone surrounded by small diamonds. He did not take Frances's hand. He lifted the ring and held it where she could see. I would like you to wear this, if you want it. Frances looked at the garnet, then at him. Not as proof. No. Not as protection. Never again. Then yes. She extended her left hand. Only then did William take it. He slid the ring onto her finger slowly. The garnet caught the spring light from the window and burned dark red against her skin. Frances turned her hand once, studying it. The symbol might have belonged to his family, but the decision belonged to her. William's thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, still certain. You have asked me that remarkably soon. I have become fond of confirmation. Then I am certain. The Dowager Duchess smiled and moved away to speak with Mrs. Wickland, granting them a small pocket of privacy within propriety. William looked at the ring again. You know the public gathering is in 6 days. I know. You do not have to wear it there. Frances lifted her hand between them. I intend to. His expression tightened with concern. Because of Judith? No. Frances met his eyes. Because this time the decision is mine. Wishiams said nothing for a moment. Then he raised her hand, paused, and waited. Frances understood the question without words and turned her fingers slightly in permission. He pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was formal enough for the room and intimate enough for both of them. Frances looked at the closed lorgnette beside her botanical notes, then back at the man before her. For months, other people had tried to decide what her sharpness meant, what her reputation meant, what her future should mean. Now, the garnet rested on her hand because she had chosen it. Nothing about that choice made her smaller. William smiled. I am beginning to think spring suits you. Frances glanced at the ring. Perhaps spring simply has better manners. On the 28th of March, the orangery at Norchester House looked almost painfully beautiful. Spring light lingered against the tall glass after sunset, softened by candles placed between tubs of citrus and camellia, while the same people who had watched Frances Mordaunt become a scandal in February gathered again beneath William Somerville's roof. No masks were permitted. Frances had insisted upon that. She entered beside Mrs. Wickland, wearing pale grey silk and the Norchester garnet ring on her left hand. The stone caught the candlelight at every movement, dark red and unmistakable. Conversations faltered. Some guests looked first at her face, others at the ring. Frances noticed both and allowed neither to alter her pace. Her mother's tortoise-shell lorgnette remained at home. Tonight she had no intention of watching the room from a distance. William stood near the center of the orangery with the Dowager Duchess. He did not cross the room to claim Frances the moment she entered. He waited until she looked toward him. Only then did he incline his head. Frances answered with the smallest nod. It was enough. Lady Judith Blythe arrived several minutes later with Lord Jasper. Judith wore ivory satin, no black feathers, and the composed expression of a woman determined to make confidence look like innocence. Jasper seemed less comfortable. His gaze moved too often toward the doors. How very brave of you, Frances, Judith said when the first greetings were complete, to appear so publicly after everything. Frances looked at her. I was invited. Of course. Judith's eyes dropped deliberately to the garnet ring, though I confess I had not realized scandal could be rewarded so handsomely. The insult moved through the room with the speed of a flame, finding dry paper. William stepped forward. Before Lady Judith says anything further, there is something I owe every person here. Francis turned toward him. They had agreed he would speak first, but only about his own conduct. Nothing else. William looked around the orangery. Several of the faces before him had been present months earlier at Larkfield Park. More had been present at the masquerade. He took no refuge in rank. Last November, I made a remark about Miss Mordaunt that was arrogant, careless, and unworthy of the authority people attach to my words. Silence gathered. William's eyes found Francis's. I said, "God help the man who marries her." A few guests shifted. No one laughed. I treated intelligence as a flaw because it challenged me. Then, when Miss Mordaunt was falsely accused at the masquerade, I made a second mistake. I believed her. That part was right. What followed was not. I announced that she would become my wife without asking whether she had any wish to do so. His voice remained steady. Miss Mordaunt corrected me publicly because I had made the error publicly. She was right. There was no engagement then. There is one now, because I asked, and she freely answered. His gaze dropped briefly to the garnet ring, then returned to the room. That is all I will say before Miss Mordaunt speaks for herself. He stepped back. The gesture mattered. Francis felt it in the sudden quiet. Months ago, William would have filled the room with his solution. Now he gave her the center and did not stand in front of it. Judith smiled faintly. "A touching confession, Your Grace, but it changes nothing about what people saw." "No," Francis said. "That is why we are here." The Dowager Duchess moved to a small table near the camellias and opened a narrow wooden box. Inside, wrapped in clean white cloth and sealed under her own custody since February, lay the black ostrich plume found near the west service passage. Fine silver wire still wound around its torn quill. Judith's face did not change, but Jasper looked at the feather too quickly. Francis faced Judith. "On the night of the masquerade, you arrived wearing 3 black plumes. Do you dispute that? I do not count feathers as a habit. Your dresser does." Judith's mouth tightened. Francis continued. "She fastened all 3 herself. She also states that you dismissed her for nearly an hour and returned with only 2. A servant may remember incorrectly." "Certainly." Francis nodded. "That is why the feather alone is not enough." Judith blinked. She had expected Francis to cling to it. Instead, Francis turned toward the Dowager Duchess. "Your Grace, would you show the quill?" The older woman lifted it carefully without removing it from the cloth. Francis addressed the room. This was found caught in the carved panel beside the service passage used by the silver-grey masked woman seen with Lord Jasper. Judith laughed softly. "A feather in a corridor proves very little." "I agree." Francis looked directly at her. "So let me ask you one question. If you remained in black throughout the masquerade, why was the 3rd plume from your own headdress found in the passage used by the woman dressed as me?" Judith's expression hardened. "Perhaps someone took it. From your head?" A murmur moved through the guests. Jasper stepped forward. "This is absurd. Half the house was in costume." Francis turned to him. "Exactly, which is why a second fact matters." William's secretary brought forward a single folded paper and gave it, not to William, but to Francis. She opened it. "The modiste who made my silver-grey domino has confirmed that a second domino, matching mine in shade, fall, hood, and lack of ornament, was commissioned shortly before the masquerade through a servant connected to House of Blythe." Judith's face lost a degree of color. Any servant might have used our direction. Then perhaps you can explain why the instruction required the garment to match mine as closely as possible. Judith did not answer. Frances folded the paper. Your dresser agreed to speak only to what she personally saw. She is not here to be shamed before you. She states that you dismissed her, returned in black, and had lost one plume. Nothing more. Frances looked toward a footman standing near the door. He had agreed to appear only long enough to confirm his part. Thomas, you need answer one question only. On the night of the masquerade, did you see a woman in silver grey use the West Service passage? The footman bowed. Yes, Miss Mordaunt. Could she have come directly from the room where I was attending the Dowager Duchess? No, miss. Not without going around by the East Gallery and secondary stair. The Dowager Duchess said clearly. Miss Mordaunt remained with me until we returned toward the ballroom. Frances inclined her head to the footman. Thank you. You may go. He left immediately. No interrogation followed. No one blocked the door. Judith watched him leave, anger beginning to crack her composure. Jasper seized upon the remaining uncertainty. Even if there was another costume, I did not know who wore it. I believed the woman in the gallery was Miss Mordaunt. Frances turned back to him. Did you? Yes. Then, why did you say loudly enough for witnesses to hear that I had refused you in Hampshire and that London had made me reconsider? Jasper's jaw tightened, because I believed it was you. But a Blythe servant had commissioned the duplicate costume before the masquerade. Frances let the silence do the work. So either you were remarkably fortunate that an unknown woman, dressed exactly as I did, chose to meet you in the gallery and happened to know of your rejected courtship, or you knew precisely what performance was taking place. Jasper glanced at Judith. That glance destroyed more than denial could preserve. Judith saw it and snapped. For heaven's sake, Jasper, stop looking at me as though I forced you. The words escaped before she could retrieve them. The room went still. Frances did not move. Forced him to do what? Judith's eyes flashed. You know perfectly well. I would like you to say it. You were supposed to become ridiculous. Judith's restraint finally broke. That was all. You were supposed to be seen as exactly what you are. Difficult, proud, hungry for attention while pretending to despise it. William was supposed to tire of defending you once he saw that you were no different from every other woman trying to catch a titled man. William's face went cold, but he remained silent. Frances asked, and Jasper? Judith gave a bitter laugh. He wanted repayment for being refused. I wanted you out of William's attention. It should have been simple. Jasper hissed, Judith, do not pretend now. You stood in that gallery willingly. That ended it. No one applauded. Frances had not wanted applause. What followed was quieter and more damaging. Mrs. Holbury, who had repeated the first rumours fastest, said, then Miss Mordaunt was never with Lord Jasper. No, the Dowager Duchess said. She was not. Sir Matthew Hale added, and the engagement announced that night did not exist. William answered, correct. Frances looked around the same faces that had once watched her as though embarrassment were proof. I do not require anyone here to admire me. I require only that what was said falsely be corrected truthfully. Several guests bowed their heads. One lady crossed the room and apologized without embellishment. Another followed. It was not affection. It was something Frances valued more in that moment, accuracy. The consequences came without theatrical threats. William informed Judith that she would no longer be received at Norchester House. Jasper was told that any expectation of William's patronage introductions, or political assistance had ended. Their father, already informed privately of the evidence, had ordered both siblings to leave London for the remainder of the season. The dresser and footman retained their positions and references. No servant paid for telling the truth. Judith left first, pale with fury. Jasper followed without looking at Francis. Only after the doors closed did William speak again. One thing remains. Francis turned toward him. He addressed the room, but there was no possession in his voice. Miss Mordaunt required no duke to make her honourable. I required her to teach me how little rank is worth when it is used without humility. Francis felt her throat tighten. William did not reach for her until the last guests had begun to disperse, and the orangery had softened into ordinary conversation. Then he came to stand before her and opened his hand between them, just as he had once done in the conservatory at Larkfield Park. He did not assume. Francis looked at his hand, then placed hers in it and deliberately intertwined their fingers. His thumb rested lightly against the garnet ring. "Still certain?" he asked. Francis looked up at him, more than I was before everyone else became certain for me. William smiled. This time no one in the room mistook the meaning of it. Sewer. 3 Sundays passed, after the truth was restored at Norchester House, and each one carried Francis Mordaunt farther from the woman's society had tried to define for her. On the 30th of March, the 6th of April, and the 13th, the banns of marriage between William Somerville, Duke of Norchester, and Miss Frances Mordaunt were read in their London parish, without interruption, scandal, or whispered objection strong enough to matter. Frances attended to her ordinary life between them. She continued her botanical correspondence, corrected 2 errors in a catalogue from a Kent grower, visited the Dowager Duchess, and refused 3 invitations she did not wish to accept. Becoming engaged to a duke had not transformed her into a woman who suddenly enjoyed every drawing-room in London. William appeared delighted by this evidence of consistency. On the morning of Saturday, the 19th of April, 1817, Francis stood inside St. George's, Hanover Square, with spring light falling through the high windows and the Norchester garnet ring warm against her hand. There were no masks. No one had arranged a surprise. No villain appeared at the church door. Judith and Jasper Blythe were already away from London under their father's authority, and Frances had no intention of granting them a place in the memory of her wedding by fearing their return. Mrs. Wickland stood near her with tears she repeatedly denied having. The Dowager Duchess looked composed until Francis caught her pressing a handkerchief briefly to one eye. William waited ahead, dressed with the severe elegance expected of his rank, but nothing in his face resembled severity when he looked at Frances. He did not look relieved to have secured her. He looked astonished that she had chosen him. That distinction remained important. The service was solemn, familiar, and mercifully free of spectacle. When Frances spoke her vows, she did so clearly. William answered with the same steadiness. Neither needed society to explain what the words meant. They had already tested promise against error, pride, refusal, apology, patience, and choice. When they emerged from the church as husband and wife, London continued around them. Carriages rolled past. Bells sounded. A small gathering of friends and family offered congratulations. Nothing in the city stopped because Frances Mordaunt had become Frances, Duchess of Norchester. She preferred it that way. At the wedding breakfast, William leaned close enough to be heard without making their conversation public. "You have been Duchess of Norchester for nearly an hour." Francis glanced at him. And yet the kingdom remains intact. I was warned your opinions might prove dangerous. You married them knowingly. I married their owner knowingly. She gave him a look. Better. He smiled. I am learning. By late afternoon, after the final guests had departed, they returned to Norchester House. Frances crossed its threshold without remembering the masquerade first. That surprised her. For weeks, the house had existed in her mind as the place where strangers had believed a costume more readily than her word, and where William, trying to protect her, had announced a future she had not chosen. Now servants greeted her without awkwardness. The Dowager Duchess had already retired to give the newly married couples some peace, and spring sunlight lay across the entrance hall without, demanding anything of her. William offered no ceremonial tour of rooms she had already seen. He merely asked, "Where would you like to go?" Frances thought for a moment. The conservatory. He nodded. Of course. They walked there together. The glass room was warmer than the April afternoon outside. Young leaves had replaced the winter bareness beyond the panes, and several camellias still held late flowers among the citrus. Frances paused beside the plant. William had once admitted he had passed for years without truly seeing. Still alive, he said. Plants often survive being overlooked. I suspect that is another criticism. You are becoming perceptive. On a small table near the windows rested two objects Frances had asked to be brought from her rooms that morning. The first was her mother's tortoiseshell lorgnette. The second was her own silver-grey masquerade mask. Not Judith's duplicate. That garment had never been recovered, and Frances had no desire to turn it into a relic. This was the mask she herself had worn, the one that had covered her face while another woman borrowed the outline of her identity. William stopped beside her. You kept it? Yes. I thought you might destroy it. Frances picked up the mask and examined its plain grey surface. That would give it too much importance. Then why keep it? Because appearances lied that night, and nearly everyone preferred the lie because it was easier than uncertainty. She set the mask down again. I would rather remember that clearly than pretend it did not happen. William looked at the mask, then at her. Do you want it removed from here? Months earlier, he might have ordered it taken away before asking. Frances noticed that he did not even reach toward it. No. Very well. She picked up the tortoiseshell lorgnette instead. The gold hinge caught the light. For years, she had raised it in rooms where observing felt safer than belonging. Her mother had taught her that distance could make people easier to understand. Frances still believed it. But understanding distance was not the same as needing it forever. She folded the lorgnette closed and placed it beside the mask. William watched quietly. No inspection, he asked. Not today. Should I be worried? Deeply. I knew marriage would make you merciless. Frances turned toward him. The garnet ring caught the sunlight as she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the table. William looked at it, then at her face. You know, he said, nothing about becoming Duchess requires you to abandon your work. I know. I have had the correspondence desk in the East morning room cleared. Not assigned. Cleared. If you dislike it, choose another. Frances raised an eyebrow. You remembered not to decide. I remembered being publicly corrected by the woman who is now my wife. It was educational, and the growers who write to me may continue writing. The catalogues may continue containing errors for you to find. My visits to nurseries, I assume I may occasionally be permitted to come if I behave. Occasionally. His expression softened. I love you. There was no crisis around the words now. No proposal followed them. No apology depended on them. They were simply true. Frances felt the difference deeply. I love you too. William stepped closer but did not take her hand. Instead, he opened his palm between them, the same quiet gesture he had once offered beneath the winter glass at Larkfield Park. Frances looked down at it and remembered every version of him contained in that simple movement. The man who had once spoken before thinking. The man who had learned to ask. The man who had failed spectacularly, corrected himself publicly, and then learned that love could not be measured by how effectively he arranged another person's life. She placed her hand in his. William closed his fingers around hers. God help the man who married you, he murmured. Frances arched one brow. He appears tolerably well. He is. He lifted her hand only after she allowed the movement and kissed her knuckles. Then he leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to her temple. Frances turned before he could withdraw and kissed his cheek. William smiled against the affection, surprised enough to please her. For accuracy? He asked. For affection? Even better. Their fingers remained joined as they turned toward the deeper part of the conservatory. Behind them, the silver-grey mask rested untouched on the table. Beside it, the tortoise-shell lorgnette remained closed. Frances did not need glass between herself and the room. She did not need a mask to survive it. The garnet on her hand warmed in the spring light as she walked beside the man she had chosen, neither ahead of him nor behind him, and William matched his step to hers without being asked.